The truth is, I'm not certain of a lot of things in my life. I'm certain that my family loves me. I'm certain that most of the time I love my family. And here I mean my children. I'm certain that most of the time I love them. I'm certain I'm fairly certain at least, that the sun is going to set tonight, and that most likely it's going to rise in the morning. I'm fairly certain that the leaves will continue to change colors, that the grass will turn brown as we change seasons. I'm fairly certain that people are going to fight. I'm fairly certain that there are going to be wars that come up and be ongoing. I'm fairly certain that there will be happiness today, somewhere, if not in your life, then in somebody's life. I'm fairly certain that at some point you're going to be frustrated very soon, and that all the rest of the emotions that one can feel are going to be felt by various people across the world today. I'm fairly certain of those things. The truth is, we all wonder what is certain in life. We find ourselves wondering what's coming next, what's in the future. We wonder for our personal lives, so we plan ahead, right? We build up savings accounts and bank accounts, and we invest in things so that we can be prepared for the future. We wonder especially about these things for relationships that we have. What's coming next in our relationships? We wonder these things for our cities and our states and even for our nation. And so we risk the unknown, what's coming next, and we hope for the best. Sometimes we guess pretty well. Other times we're not so great at guessing what's coming up. We're all looking for certainty. It's what we desire. Abram was no different. As we read in the story today, you're going to see that Abram wanted certainty. God had promised him a descendant, and still God had failed to deliver on that promise. And so Abram began to wonder, did I hitch my wagon to the right, or did I hitch my train to the right wagon at all? Maybe this deity who spoke to me isn't really the one that I should be following. Maybe I should be looking for another. And so he questioned whether Yahweh was actually going to follow through, whether Yahweh was on his side or not. But as we read the story today, as we're about to do, I think you're going to see how God assured Abram in a couple of ways that yes, indeed, God is on his side. Let's look at Genesis 15, 1 through 18 together. That's where we're going to read from right now. The word of the Lord from Genesis. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." And the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land of your possession, as your possession." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?" The Lord told him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land. for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. Now some of you are wondering, what's going on in the story? Why does this seem so strange? Well, we're going to talk about that this morning. I want to begin by us thinking about Abram's uncertainty here. We're going to kind of home in on that and focus in on what Abram is uncertain about and how God reassures him. But it is a bit of a strange chapter if you are unfamiliar with some of the details of it. So let's talk about it for a little bit. The first thing that I want to really focus on is this idea of not being afraid. So to understand what God is telling Abram in this chapter, we really actually need to back up briefly to chapter 14 for a moment and look at what happened there. In chapter 14, Abram had to go and rescue Lot. Now some of you may remember this part of the story at least, that Lot and Abram had separated because they had become too large to live together any longer. Their groups of people had grown up too much. They were overtaxing the land, and so they had to divide up. Lot chose a really luscious and great part of the land, and that's where he moved to. But in doing so, he made himself vulnerable to attack from these kings in the land. And so a group of kings in the area banded together to seize more land, more territory. And part of that seizure was where Lot had taken up to live. When Abram heard about this, he gathered his fighting men and he set off to rescue his nephew. It's a really straightforward story. There's really not a lot to it. Man moves off and thinks he's protected. He's not actually protected. He gets attacked and gets taken into captivity. Somebody else comes and rescues him. Very straightforward story. But there are a couple of details to key in on, I think, which inform God's words to Abram that we just read in chapter 15. Firstly, there's this king Melchizedek from the city of Salem, later becomes Jerusalem. And this king Melchizedek, when he blesses Abram in verse 20 of chapter 14, he says these words, Blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. It seems like an obvious thing to say. We know that God is at work in Abram's life, right? God is really the one doing and performing this victory. But we'll see how it connects here in just a moment, a little bit deeper. Secondly, after being defeated, the king of Sodom requests that Abram return his people. So the king of Sodom was one of those 5 kings who marched against Lot and the other peoples. And now he's been defeated by Abram and his band of merry men. And the king of Sodom requests that Abram return his people who were captured in battle, but with the stipulation that Abram and his people can keep all of the goods that they have seized from the king of Sodom. A tempting request at that time, I think, given the fact that there was no such thing as mass production. They don't have canned goods to carry with them. There is no mass production of goods and food at that time. But Abram refused this gesture. I wonder why. I know it says that he doesn't want the king of Sodom to take any credit. That's what he says in the text. Abram says to him, no, I'm not taking any of these things lest you take credit for my becoming wealthy. I think that's probably part of it. But I wonder also if Abram knows the plight of these men, were he to send them off with no clothing, no food, nothing to protect them from the heat and the cold, no food and water to get them from where they are now to getting them home. I wonder if Abram thought about their families that were at home waiting on these men to return. Did he know that sending them off without supplies was as good as a death sentence anyway? I wonder it wasn't for mercy that he refused these things. That's speculation on my part. I like to think well of Abram. But let's circle back to what Melchizedek said in chapter 14. The words that it was the Lord who defeated Abram's enemies. As humans, we have a tendency to make our accomplishments about ourselves. You've probably noticed that in other people. You've probably noticed that about yourself. We like to make it all about number one. And number one is me. Even those of us, yes, people like myself, People who don't like the spotlight, and you may wonder, then why are you standing in front of us every week and talking? That's a good question. I ask myself that every week. Even we appreciate being recognized for hard work. Anybody in here like your birthday? Like you really love your birthday. You love celebrating your birthday. You love to be celebrated on your birthday. I'd like to show hands. Who really enjoys your birthday and loves being celebrated on your birthday? Weirdos. How? I can't stand it. I don't want anybody to know when my birthday is. I don't want people to wish me happy birthday. I just want to be left alone on my birthday. In fact, I tell my family that.
Amen.
Thank you. My kids don't get it, so they make a big deal out of me on my birthday, and I just want to shoo them away. The truth is, we all secretly, or maybe not so secretly, want someone to recognize the good work that we do. We all want that. So we look for it in our spouses, we look for it in our children look for it in us, we look for it in our coworkers, in our bosses, all these sorts of people we want to be recognized. Abram might have felt that way as well. Perhaps after this battle, he was ready to go home and say, hey guys, look at me. Look at what I did. The great victory that he had won against these opposing kings. Except this annoying king of Salem comes along, this guy Melchizedek, whoever he is, and he reminds Abram that the victory doesn't belong to him at all. He might have shown up, but it's not about him. The victory belongs to the Lord. The Lord defeated Abram's enemies on his behalf. And so this connects actually to what the Lord himself says to Abram in verse 1 of chapter 15. Yes, we're finally coming to chapter 15. You're going to get there eventually. The Lord says to Abram in verse 1, do not be afraid. I will protect you, or I am your shield. The Lord makes no qualms about who's really in control of the situations that Abram faces in his life. The Lord is Abram's shield. The Lord protects him. No matter the size of Abram's army, and it's not very big at this moment, no matter the size of any fence or wall he may construct around his family and his people to protect them, that's not really the protection that he's getting. The Lord is his true protector, so he need not be afraid. And that message of do not be afraid is reverberated across the pages of Scripture. If you read both the Old and New Testaments, you will see it over and over and over again. Do not be afraid. It echoed constantly across the ears of the Israelites. Do not be afraid. God is on your side. Abram had reason to fear going to rescue his nephew Lot. He had just a small fighting force against seasoned armies, 5 armies of kings in the land. Yet, he went anyway to do the right thing in that situation. The Israelites had reasons to fear over the centuries, yet God continued to remind them to not be afraid. You and I have reasons to fear various things in our lives as well. If 2020 isn't a reason to fear, I don't know what is. And yet the message, do not be afraid, reverberates in our ears as well. Lord is our shield and protects us. Paul says in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can ever be against us? In other words, what need have we to fear? Ultimately, Abram is afraid for his family's future. He says that, "O Lord, you have failed me. It's your fault that I have no descendant. What are you doing?" How can God fulfill these promises he's made to Abram if he doesn't provide a son? So God reassures him that his own son would be his descendant and be his heir and receive the inheritance. And so Abram believed the Lord in that moment, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, I mean, if we ended there, like, wow, that's really cool. Abram is righteous. Paul picks up on this moment in Romans and talks about how righteous Abram is, and shouldn't we all be like Abram? I mean, it's a great moment to end. Like, if we stopped right there, chapter 15 ended there, woohoo, we're good. But that's not how it ends, because Abram asks this question: how can I be sure? That doesn't sound like righteousness to me. That doesn't sound like faith to me. Or maybe that's exactly what it is. Maybe faith, maybe righteousness isn't about having all the answers. Maybe faith, maybe righteousness isn't about being certain all the time, even though that's what we want. Maybe faith, maybe righteousness is about knowing that I don't know everything, about knowing that I'm not certain about everything, but I'm still going to lean into this God who's big enough to take all of my uncertainty and all of my doubts and failures. I began this sermon talking about the idea of uncertainty and how Abram himself was uncertain. And in the second section of chapter 15, we see Abram's uncertainty truly on display. Abram asked God this question: how can I be sure? God, how do I know? God's been making these huge promises to Abram. Promised this large area of land as an inheritance. He's promised a descendant from which a whole nation would spring up. He was promised that his lineage would be a blessing to the whole world. Oh God, how can I be sure? How do I know that you're actually still with me? And so now Abram is not so certain that God really intends to keep his promises, even after God just assured him that he is. It's a standoff. It's a good old-fashioned Western standoff. Abram has just asked this crushing question of God: how can I be sure? I wonder how God felt in this moment. I know how I felt when somebody has questioned my integrity. It angers me to no end. You can question me about a lot of things. You can ask me all kinds of questions, but to question my integrity, that bothers me. It really, deeply bothers me to be questioned about my integrity. That's what Abram's doing to God. Not his wife, not a friend. He's questioning God's integrity in Genesis 15. I wonder if God was a little bit angry or a little bit hurt, because that's what Abram's doing. That's certainly not the response that we expect from a great man of faith. Not from the man who had just had righteousness credited to him because of his faith. But here it is. Moment after moment of uncertainty. And so how does God respond? With anger? Not that I can see. With frustration? Maybe. Instead of God striking Abram, and starting all over with someone else, which is probably what I would have done had I been God, God chose to reaffirm his promise with a covenant. Much like some married couples decide to renew their vows, later on after they've been married for a time, God decides to renew his covenant with Abram and provide another sign of his sincerity and proof that he's going to follow through on his promises. Now, the covenant ritual here may seem strange to us. Not may, it is strange to us. Get the may out of there. It is strange to us. It's strange to our eyes and our ears. The original audience of Genesis would have understood the significance of what God is doing in this covenant. They weren't struggling with understanding it here. The cutting of the animals, that kind of gross part that I read, the cutting of the animals in half and passing through them seems unnecessary to us. But the use of animals in this way seems to show the seriousness of the covenant being made between the two parties. Additionally, as a little aside for those of you who like learning the vocabulary of the Bible, as I've done so in the past, the verb for to make a covenant in Hebrew is actually the verb to cut a covenant. When you make a covenant in Hebrew, you don't make a covenant, you cut a covenant. There's a lot of Old Testament scholars, Jewish scholars, who believe that verb to cut a covenant comes directly from a practice like this where they would cut the animals in half, because this was the way to make a covenant. So you cut the animals, you're cutting a covenant. I know it's a strange thing, but there it is, right? A fun little tidbit for you, something you can go impress your friends with. And how did God show up in this moment? How does God display himself? How does God reveal himself. He used a smoking firepot and a flaming torch. Odd objects, to say the least, or at least odd to me. Why these two things? I can't give you a short answer. Again, this morning is all about uncertainty, not certainty. But I can give you my best educated guesses. While incense plays no part in our modern worship, the use of incense and smoke from fires did play a very prominent place in ancient worship, even in ancient Israelite worship, even to Yahweh himself. There is the mysterious way that smoke rises and disappears that connects with the unknown, with gods and the unknown, and with God in particular. In Genesis 8:21, we see a connection to smoke and the aroma that it produced in the sacrifice and how that was pleasing to God. So there is this idea in Scripture that smoke plays this part. Again, I can't be certain that that's why the smoking fire pot here is used, but I think it's probably connected to that. The flaming torch is a little bit easier to make an educated guess on, and probably something that you have already thought that I'm just going to reaffirm in your mind. God is most often represented by fire in the Old Testament. Think about when Moses first encounters God. How does he encounter him? At a burning bush. Think about the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Every single night that they wandered, how did God show up? A pillar of fire. It's not uncommon for God to be represented by fire. Fire, think about California right now, on fire. It's hard to contain. It is hard to stop. Fire is all-consuming. In Hebrews, in fact, God is called an all-consuming fire. I think that one's a little more obvious about why the torch. Although you have to admit, it's a pretty cool scene, right? Abram wakes up from this deep sleep that he's been in, and this smoking fire pot and this flaming torch are just hovering through the air, floating through these carcasses. It's pretty cool. But the reaffirmation of God's seriousness in choosing Abram here is important. I wonder how the story of Abram's life might have been different had God not taken the moment to do this. What if instead, in Abram's moment of uncertainty or doubt, and Abram says, God, how can I be sure that you're going to do this? What if instead God had said, I don't know, you really can't. Take it or leave it, Abram. I mean, what might have been different? Would Abram have given up on God in that moment? Perhaps. Again, what if God had gotten angry instead and said, you know what? I'm doing away with this whole Abram guy. I'm going to start over with somebody else. Maybe Melchizedek. He seems like a better candidate. He has faith in me. God, in this moment, chooses to renew this covenant with him. It's a really beautiful moment. God recognizes Abram's need to see proof that God is serious, that he is going to follow through. And so God took the time to prove to him on 2 occasions here that he is on Abram's side. God is on our side too. Maybe he's not going to show up with a smoking firepot and a flaming torch. I'm not encouraging any of you to go out and split animals in half, wait on God to show up. Okay? I'm not going to encourage that. What I am going to say is that God has already shown up to us in a more powerful way, in the person of Jesus. God didn't show up as fire. He showed up as a sacrifice. He showed up as the person to show us beyond any reasonable doubt that he is serious about us and about having relationships with us. So a couple of things to take away from chapter 15 today. The first thing is, about what in your life is God speaking the words, do not be afraid. We're afraid about a lot of things. So what is God speaking to you today? Do not be afraid. do you need to hear that about? The second thing is, how would you respond to someone who asks the question about God? How can I be sure? That's a tough question to answer. Maybe you don't have an answer this morning. I'm not certain that I do. How can we be sure? Is God big enough to handle that question from us? Better. And I think we do ourselves a disservice. We do each other a disservice. We do God a disservice when we think that God is not big enough to handle our question. God, how can I be sure? God is big enough to handle that question from you, from me, from all of us. How can we be sure? Genesis 15. There's a lot there. There was more that we could have talked about for sure. The good news from Genesis 15 is do not be afraid. Even in your uncertainty, do not be afraid. God is your shield. God is on your side. Amen. We have family time now where we get to share together. We get to share frustrations. We get to share, maybe you want to share what you're afraid about this morning. Maybe you want to share what you are uncertain of this morning. That's what we're here for. We're here to listen to you, to pray with you, to cry with you, to share in those things. Not because we have all the answers, and not because you're going to be given all the answers right now in this life, but because we're a family and we take care of each other. It's also a time where we get to celebrate together. Maybe it is your birthday, and you just didn't want to tell anybody, but now you're going to. Whatever it is, we're a family, and that's what we do together. We celebrate, we cry, we take care of each other. So whatever needs you may have, please feel free and welcome to come share those with us as we stand and sing.